In the kingdom of ether, mirrors were forbidden. No one questioned it. Everyone accepted it as a commandment passed down through generations. Reflective surfaces were shattered, hidden or covered. The priests said it was the will of the gods, that reflections were dangerous, sinful. They said to see your reflection was to invite the unknown. But for Aric, a kind-hearted young man, these were just tales, and rules were rules, until the night he accidentally saw his own reflection. Aric's life had never been easy. He was different, an outcast. In his village, people mocked him because he could read words backward without difficulty, a trait no one else had. What was a curious gift to him was seen as a curse by others, just one more reason to bully and torment him. He lived a quiet, lonely life, marked by small acts of kindness that went unnoticed in a world that had turned hard and cruel. But everything changed the night he saw his reflection. It was a crisp autumn evening, the air heavy with the smell of burning wood and falling leaves. Aric had gathered with a group of friends, if they could even be called that, around a fire in the village square to listen to old Renard, the storyteller. Renard had lived long enough to know all the old tales, and that night he spoke of the forbidden reflections. They say the gods forbid mirrors for a reason. Renard began, his voice low and gravelly, the firelight casting shadows across his weathered face. But it wasn't vanity or sin. No, the real reason was far worse. Reflections are doorways. They are the worst parts of us, waiting for a chance to come through. The group fell silent, leaning in to listen. Aric felt a chill run down his spine, though he told himself it was just the cold night air. They're not just copies of us, Renard continued. They are shadows, twisted versions, our worst traits given form. If you ever see your reflection, you've already given them what they need. They only need to be seen once. After that, they can follow you. They can take your life. Thomas, the loudest of the group, scoffed. That's ridiculous! You're saying reflections are monsters. Please, it's just an old man's story. Renard's eyes gleamed with warning. Mock it if you like, boy, but once they see you, they can find you. Thomas grinned, snatching up a dull, reflective steel plate from a nearby stall. Let's test this old tale, shall we? He raised the plate to his face, but before he could look, Aric lunged forward, snatching the plate from his hands. Thomas, stop! You don't know what you're doing! Aric warned, but in the chaotic motion the plate spun, catching the firelight. And in that moment, Aric saw his own reflection. It was just for a second, but that was enough. His own eyes stared back at him, but there was something terribly wrong. His reflection didn't blink when he did. Worse, it smiled, a grin that twisted too wide. Aric recoiled, dropping the plate. The metallic clatter echoed through the square, but no one else noticed what had just happened. No one but Aric, who felt his heart pound as the chill of something dark settled inside him. That night, Aric had his first nightmare. He woke up drenched in sweat, gasping for breath. The image of his own grinning face burned into his mind. In the dream, his reflection had been standing at the foot of his bed, watching him, whispering words he couldn't quite understand. Its eyes were black, hollow. Its smile never faltered. It reached for him, cold fingers brushing his skin, and Aric jolted awake. The next night, the dream returned. Only this time, the reflection was closer. It stood over him, leaning down, whispering again, its voice distorted and layered with a sickening, inhuman tone. Aric's days became a waking nightmare as well. Everywhere he went, he saw it, his reflection. In puddles, in windows, in polished metal. It was always there, always grinning, always watching. And it wasn't just a mirror image anymore. It moved when he didn't, smiled when he was terrified. It followed him, stalking him, haunting his dreams every night. No one believed him. The villagers mocked him, called him paranoid. They thought his fears were just more of his strangeness. Even the church dismissed his worries, telling him to pray for guidance. But Aric knew the truth. Something had crossed over, something terrible. His reflection was in his world now. It was a cold, moonlit night when Aric, sleepless and desperate, wandered the village square alone. He had no idea what to do. No one cared. No one believed him. He was losing his grip on reality, the reflection haunting him both in sleep and wakefulness. That's when he met Garren. The older man sat alone on the edge of the square, his eyes shadowed, his face worn with the weight of knowledge. He seemed to be watching Aric closely, as if waiting for him. "You've seen it, haven't you?" Garren said, his voice low and rough. Aric froze, his heart skipping a beat. "Seen what?" "Your reflection," Garren said quietly. "It's in your world now, isn't it?" Aric's blood ran cold. "How do you know that?" "Because I've been where you are," Garren said with a heavy sigh. "But for me it's too late. I can never go back." "What do you mean?" Aric asked, sitting down beside him. Garren glanced at him, his eyes filled with understanding. "You're not in the real world, Aric. Not anymore. You're in the reflections world." Aric shook his head, confused. "What are you talking about?" "You've been living in a backwards world. That's why everything feels wrong. People here are cruel because they're reflections, twisted versions of the real people who exist in the world you were born in. This is where the worst parts of people stay. Your reflection, the one you saw, was just waiting for the chance to cross over." Aric's mind spun, his pulse racing. "But why now?" Garren looked away, his expression grim. "When you were young, very young, you must have caught a glimpse of yourself. That's all it takes. If a reflection sees you as a child, it takes your place. Your body wasn't strong enough to resist, so it crossed over, and you've been stuck here ever since. You've been living in the reflections world, thinking it was your own." Aric's heart pounded in his chest. "And when I saw my reflection in the plate, it got sucked back into its world," Garren explained. "That's why it's haunting you now. It's trying to kill you, to take your life for good. If it kills you, it'll take your eyes and return to the real world." "My eyes?" "Yes," Garren said, his voice heavy with regret. "Your eyes are the key. They're what the reflection needs to pass back through. If it kills you, it'll take your eyes with it. Once it does, it'll go back to your world and live your life again, and you'll be trapped here forever." Aric swallowed hard. "How do I get back?" Garren met his gaze, his expression serious. "There's only one way. You have to see your reflection again, through the same object, once more, and then you have to walk through it, into the real world." Aric's head swam with the weight of what Garren was saying. "But why can't you go back?" Garren's face darkened. "My reflection died in the real world. I've been trapped here ever since. With my reflection gone, there's no way for me to ever see myself again. I'll never get out." Aric's chest tightened. "You're stuck here?" Garren nodded. "I heard about you for a long time, but I wasn't sure if you were actually trapped here like me. Then I heard you were being haunted by your reflection in your sleep. That's when I knew." The next night, Aric knew the reflection would come for him again. This time it wouldn't stop until it killed him. He could feel it. He tried to stay awake, but the exhaustion was too much. His eyelids grew heavy, and before long sleep overtook him. And with sleep came the reflection. This time it was right there, standing over him as his body froze. Sleep paralysis gripped him, his heart pounding in terror as the reflection's cold hands wrapped around his throat. "I'm almost home," the reflection whispered, its black eyes gleaming with malevolence. Its fingers tightened, and Aric felt his life slipping away. Suddenly, out of the shadows, Garren lunged. With a swift motion, he drove a knife into the reflection's back. The creature shrieked, its body convulsing violently before dissolving into a dark, oily mist. "It's dead," Garren said, panting heavily. "It can't come back now?" Aric sat up, gasping for air. His body trembled with the aftershock of what had just happened, his mind spinning. He had been so close to death, so close to losing everything. He looked at Garren, gratitude and confusion swirling in his chest. "But what now?" Aric asked, his voice weak. "You need to get out of here," Garren said, wiping the black mist from the blade. "This world isn't yours. You don't belong here, and you never did." Aric nodded, feeling the weight of the truth pressing down on him. He had been living in the reflections world all along, a twisted, cruel version of the real world, where everyone around him was a reflection of their worst traits. That's why they were so mean, why his life had felt so miserable. They weren't real. "But how do I go back?" Aric asked, his voice trembling. "You said I have to see my reflection again. But where?" Garren pointed to the steel plate that lay on the ground where Aric had first seen his reflection. The surface still faintly gleamed, its dull reflection waiting. "There," Garren said. "That's where it all started. You need to look at your reflection one last time, and then step through." Aric picked up the plate, staring down at the surface. His reflection stared back at him. This time it didn't smile. It was just his face, tired and worn, but it was his. He took a deep breath and turned to Garren. "Come with me," Aric said, his heart aching for the man who had saved him. Garren shook his head, a sad smile on his lips. "I can't. My reflection is dead in the real world. There's no way for me to ever leave. I'm stuck here in this place with no way back." Aric's chest tightened. He had finally found someone who understood, who knew the pain of being trapped in this twisted world. And yet there was no way to save him. "I'm sorry," Aric whispered. Garren shook his head again, his smile fading. Don't be. You have a chance, don't waste it. Go back to your world. Live your life. Aric nodded, his hands shaking as he turned back to the plate. He stared into his reflection, his mind racing with everything that had happened, everything Garren had told him. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped forward. The moment Aric crossed through the reflective surface, the air around him changed. Everything felt lighter, clearer, as if a weight had been lifted from his chest. He looked around, blinking in disbelief. He was back in the real world. For a moment he stood there, letting the realization wash over him. The people around him moved with ease, their faces kinder, their words softer. It was as if the cruelty and harshness that had surrounded him his entire life had melted away. Aric walked through the village, his heart pounding with a strange mix of relief and confusion. Everything felt right. And then something else struck him, the words. He saw a sign and instinctively read it. But this time he didn't struggle. The words were clear and easy to read, the way he had always read them, backwards. But here in this world it was normal. He wasn't strange. He wasn't mocked for it. Everyone reads like me. Aric whispered to himself, a wave of realization crashing over him. His whole life he had been ridiculed for reading words backwards. But that was because he had been in the reflections world, where everything was flipped, distorted. Here in the real world, his way was the right way. He felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. Everything that had made him feel different, mocked and broken, this was where he truly belonged. But as the relief settled in, a shadow lingered in the back of his mind. Garren was still trapped, and though the reflection was gone, the horror of what had almost happened stayed with him. He would never forget what Garren had done for him, sacrificing his own chance at freedom to save Aric. And now, Aric had a responsibility to live the life that had been stolen from him for so long. Before Aric could fully relax, Garren's final words echoed in his mind. Your reflection is dead now, but you must make sure it stays that way. He knew what Garren had meant. The reflection had tried to take his life, to steal his eyes and return to the real world. But now that it was dead, Aric was safe. However, he would never be able to forget that a world of reflections still existed, a place where twisted versions of people lived out their worst traits. The horror of the reflections world would stay with him, even as he lived his life in peace. The darkness, the haunting dreams, the terrifying knowledge that reflections waited in the shadows, these were things he would carry with him forever. But Aric was no longer afraid. He had survived the nightmare, crossed back into his world, and now he was free. As he walked away from the village, the sun setting behind him, Aric whispered a quiet thanks to Garren, knowing that his life had been saved by a man who would never know freedom himself. And as the light faded, Aric glanced at a nearby stream. He caught a glimpse of his own face in the water, just for a second. This time it didn't smile.